Good afternoon, everyone. I am Aubrey A. Locsin, and together with my partner, Jorina Jubel Sumaga, we are going to report about discursive psychology. Discursive psychology is a version of discourse analysis that emerged from a critique of cognitivism. It was introduced into British social psychology when Pater and Wetherell published the book entitled Discourse and Social Psychology Beyond Attitudes and Behavior. This book presents a critique of cognitivism that is followed by a detailed analysis of interview transcripts using a discourse analytic approach. Edward and Potter later provided the label Discursive Psychology in 1992. Discursive psychology is concerned with knowing how people use discursive resources to achieve interpersonal objectives in a social interaction, such as justifying their actions, blaming other people, or disclaiming an unpleasant social identity. It is concerned with the discourse practices, and it studies what people do with language and emphasizes the performative qualities of discourse. The focus of this analysis is on the action orientation of talk, or how participants use their discursive resources and with what effects. Discursive psychology is considered to be a psychology as it is concerned with various psychological phenomena, such as memory or identity, which are conceptualized as discursive actions and not cognitive processes. Justification, rationalization, categorization, attribution, naming, and blaming are psychological activities and also discursive practices that are used by participants to fulfill their interpersonal objectives and manage their stake in social interactions. Consequently, prejudice, identity, memory, or trust, which are psychological concepts, become something that individuals do instead of something that they have or are. And now, we're going to talk about how to collect data in a discursive psychology. There are various ways to collect data, and this can be done through using a naturally occurring text and talk. Naturally occurring text and talk are used in analyzing discourse because the research questions addressed in discursive psychology is concerned with how people manage accountability and stake in their everyday life. These questions are best answered by analyzing conversations that are unsolicited and take place in a familiar setting, such as home or workplace. Recordings of natural occurring telephone conversations, police suspect interviews, medical consultations, social workers conferences, radio interviews with politicians, counseling sessions are examples of natural occurring talk that have been used by discourse analysts. Another way of collecting data is through a semi-structured interviews. Due to ethical and practical difficulties in obtaining data from a naturally occurring text or talk, semi-structured interviews are used to generate data. One disadvantage of using this is participants are orienting towards the interview situation, which will reveal more about how they manage their stake as an interviewee than the discursive strategies they used in everyday life. The analysis of a semi-structured interview should include both the interviewer's and interviewee's comments. Researchers can also collect data through a group discussion. Setting up a group discussion, preferably within a pre-existing group, simulates a natural occurring conversation wherein participants will probably be more relaxed and spontaneous than in a one-to-one interview with a researcher. And now, we are going to talk about the preparation of transcript. A transcript of the material to be analyzed should be prepared before discourse analysis can happen. Transcription is an extremely time-consuming process. It can take at least 10 hours to transcribe a 1-hour-long interview and even longer when transcribing group interviews. It is also a labor-intensive process, especially the one used in a conversation analysis. So discourse analysts often adopt a reduced transcription style of this, wherein the key features of the original transcription notation are retained. Speech errors, pauses, interruptions, changes in volume and emphasis, and the audible intake of breath are indicated in the transcript. The non-linguistic aspects of the conversation are also retained, such as the delay, hesitation, or the emphasis, because the way something is said can affect its meaning. The next topic we're gonna talk about is the procedural guideline for the analysis of discourse. The first part of this procedural guideline is reading. Researchers should read the transcript at least once without any attempt to analyze it. This is important because it will allow the researcher to experience the discursive effects of the text as a reader and become aware of what the text is doing. For instance, a text may appear or sound like an apology even though there were no words like "I am sorry" that was stated in it. Remember, the purpose of this discourse analysis is to identify how the text manages to do that. The next one is coding. After reading and rereading the transcripts, coding or the selection of the material to be analyzed is done in light of the research question. For example, if our research question is concerned with the ways in which heterosexual adults talk about safer sex and the risk of HIV transmission, all references to condoms and its uses, the sexual safety, would need to be selected. All potentially relevant materials should be included, even if those are indirectly or vaguely related to the research question. Also, all implicit instructions must be included in this stage. Coding helps select sections of the text that will constitute the data. Analysis. It is recommended that throughout the process of discourse analysis, researchers ask questions such as, "Why am I reading this passage in this way? What features of the text produce this reading?" Analysis of textual data is generated by paying close attention to the constructive and functional dimensions of discourse. The context, variability, and construction of discursive accounts need to be attended in order to facilitate systematic and sustained exploration of the said dimensions. The researchers looks at how the text construct its objects and subjects, how such constructions vary across discursive contexts, and with what consequences they may be deployed. To identify diverse constructions of subjects and objects in a text, we need to pay attention to the terminology, stylistic and grammatical features, preferred metaphors, and figures of speech that may be used in their construction. According to Potter and Wetherell, these systems of terms are known as the interpretative repertoire. Different repertoire are used to construct different versions of events. This can be used by the same speaker in different discursive contexts in the pursuit of different social objectives. In an interpretative repertoire, it is used to construct an alternative and often contradictory version of events. Identifying the action orientation of accounts is part of analyzing discourse, and this can be done by paying careful attention to the discursive context within which such accounts are produced and tracing their consequences for the participants in a conversation. This can only be done satisfactorily based on an analysis of both the interviewer's and the interviewee's contribution to the conversation. It should be remembered that discourse analysis requires us to examine language and context.
Good day, everyone. So now we would be talking about the part 2 of the Discursive Psychology report. Hello guys, I hope you're doing okay. My name is Jabal Sumagang and I will be talking about the second part of the Discursive Psychology report. Okay, so now let's go and talk about the advantages of using Discursive Psychology as your methodology. Advantage number 1. It focuses on what is said. It does not take into consideration other factors unless relevant, like age, ethnicity, gender. This removes any kind of biases that may occur, so it doesn't pay attention to other factors about the participants, but rather focuses on what the participants are saying. Advantage number 2. It highlights underlying social assumptions in communication. It asks the question, what is this statement trying to do, instead of simply accepting the statement as it is. Hence, instead of what do the participants' responses tell us about their attitudes, beliefs, or thoughts, we interrogate the internal organization of the discourse and ask, what is this discourse doing? So discursive psychology does not take the statements of a participant at face value. Advantage number 3. It shows how behavior is socially constructed. According to Wetherill Potter 1992, that discourse psychological analysis focuses on the activities of justification, rationalization, categorization, attribution, making sense, naming, blaming, and identifying, which are quintessential psychological activities and behavior. Discursive psychology pays attention to the action orientation of the discourse coming from the participant. Thus, the researcher needs to pay careful attention to the discursive context within which such accounts are produced. Unlike linguistic approaches that focus only on the rules of language use, the discourse analysis emphasizes the contextual meaning of language. So now let's talk about the limitations of discursive psychology. So there are two types of limitations. The first limitation is limitations in focus, and the second one is the inherent limitations. Okay, so the first limitations or limitations in focus. So first, discursive psychology is interested in discourse and discourse only. This is what Langdridge referred to as the lack of person. Discursive psychologists suggest that if we are interested in a phenomena such as memory, social identity, or the emotions, we should study the ways in which people negotiate their meanings in conversation with one another. Next, this version of discourse analysis is concerned with public discourse, and it does not provide any guidance as to how we may study internalized or private manifestations of discourse such as thoughts or awareness. Next, discursive psychology adopts a rather narrow behavioristic focus, being concerned only with observable, in this case linguistic, behavior. They don't take other circumstances into account, but focuses mainly on the discursive devices, rhetorical strategies, and rhetoric resources. Next, let's go to the inherent limitations of discursive psychology. First one, while a large amount of data may sound impressive, discourse analysis is also very time-consuming, so it is important not to become swamped with too much data. So the data that you collect should be according to research aims. As with the source of data, it is good practice to explain the criteria for the inclusion of the data in the corpus. Indeed, having a clear rationale for this can be more important than the amount of data that you collected. Another inherent limitations of discursive psychology is that it's unable to account for why particular individuals or groups of individuals pursue particular discursive objectives, such as disclaim, blame, or judge or explain. For example, why do some people find it difficult to say things such as I'm sorry or I love you, even though it would be strategically useful to do so? Okay, so another inherent limitation of discursive psychology is that it assumes that all conversation is driven by stake and interest. However, it is unable to account for what motivates people to adopt or fail to adopt a particular stake or to pursue or fail to pursue a particular interest. For example, why are some people lost for words whenever they try to speak to someone whom they like, even though they are driven by the interest to make a conversation? And lastly, discursive psychology also has the assumption that meaning is produced through and in the text, and that there is therefore no need to look outside of the text for further information. However, we must remember that it may be necessary to be aware of wider social meanings and functions to interpret the use of discourse in particular contexts satisfactorily. Example: in order to read a suspect's silence within the context of a police suspect interview, it would help us to know whether or not the police officer was holding a gun. Now let's proceed to how to write a discourse analysis paper. But first, here are things that you have to remember before writing a discourse analysis paper. Number one, it cannot be learned from one day to the next, and it cannot be followed like a recipe. Number two, Billig, 1997, warns that discourse analysis is not a set of methodological procedures that can be learned in the absence of its wider theoretical approach to psychology. Number three, conducting a discourse analysis is a difficult thing to explain. Therefore, this step-by-step guide must be seen as just that, a guide, with suggestions to follow to conduct a discourse analysis. According to Potter and Wetherell, 1987, doing discourse analysis is like riding a bicycle, in that it is not the case of stating, first you do this, then you do that, and that there is no analytic method. They do not do this to be difficult or to make analysis appear mysterious. They say this because conducting a discourse analysis is a difficult thing to explain. Therefore, this step-by-step guide must be seen just as that, a guide. Here are the pre-stages. Number one, deciding on an appropriate question for discourse analysis. How do people justify X? How do people argue for Y? How do people accomplish Z? It should generate an action orientation, not a causation. For example, how do children interpret and construct bullying in the peer group? Number two, picking appropriate data for sources of analysis. There was a debate within discursive psychology whether data should be generated through interviews for the purpose of discourse analysis. However, according to Potter, these data are contrived and claims participants may be influenced of the expectation by the research. Thus, naturally occurring talk is better because it has not been influenced in any way by the researcher. Also, under this pre-stage, we also need to establish the social and historical context in which the material was produced and intended to be received. We also need to gather factual details of when and where the content was created, who the author is, who published it, and whom it was disseminated to. As well as understanding the real-life context of the discourse, you also need to conduct a literature review on the topic and construct a theoretical framework to guide your analysis. And lastly, you need to generate a corpus. Corpus is the collection of all the appropriate data that will be analyzed. Not all of the corpus will make it to the final report, but it is necessary to look at the wide range of data to base the analysis on. Writing up research using a large amount of data is impressive, but it is time-consuming. Thus, analysis should focus on data that are according to research aims. Analysis. The analysis of textual data is generated by paying close attention to the constructive and functional dimensions of discourse. To facilitate a systematic and sustained exploration of these dimensions, context, variability, and construction of these discursive accounts need to be attended to. Number 1. Context. The context within which an account is produced provides the analyst with information about the organization and the function of the account, that is, its action orientation. Number 2. Variability. Variability in accounts draws attention to the requirements of the discursive context within which speakers are located and the ways in which they orient towards such requirements. Let me give you an example. You experienced an embarrassing moment where you accidentally got drunk and slept in the sidewalk. So there are going to be two different stories if you tell it to your friends and when you tell it to the police or to the people who saw you. When you tell it to your friends, you want to make them laugh by your story. That is your action orientation. When you talk to the police, your action orientation would be, we want to avoid getting embarrassed by what happened. So the words we use to describe what happened will vary by context. We may use different vocabulary, different metaphors, different language. So variability is to be expected. This is because speakers orient towards the context within which they speak. Number 3. Discursive construction. Different discursive constructions of one and the same subject contain different explanations and evaluations. This means that objects are not talked about but constituted through discourse and therefore quite literally talked into being. The most famous example of this is the tribal example is Santa Claus himself. There is no real, concrete, tangible referent for Santa Claus. Nothing that we can see, touch, and point out that is materially Santa Claus. But Santa Claus is a pronounced feature of Christian culture because we are constantly repeating the story of Santa Claus to each other. We think that the concept is silly, but we tell it to our children, and when they grow up and discover that the story is silly in their own, they will still tell it to their children. The concept of Santa Claus invokes a cultural practice of gift giving. It creates an array of social expectations. It reinforces certain Christian principles, like spirit of generosity. The concept of Santa Claus is rich with social meaning and practices that have solidity and power in the world, despite having no source except our continued discussion. This is usually how transcripts are written, using Jefferson's style system of transcription, providing the necessary detail required to analyze conversations. Let me give you an example of an extract of how the Jefferson style transcript looks like and also how it is said. Here's a conversation of Nancy and Agnes talking on the phone.
Hello? Hi! Oh, hi! How are you, Agnes? Fine. Your line's been busy. Yeah, my father's wife called me. So when she calls me, I always talk for a long time, 'cause she can afford it and I can't.
So here, language serves as two different functions. First, it describes things. Your line's been busy, my father's wife called me, and it also does things like, how are you? Or hello. So from the description to action. So in line number 4, it says there, your line's been busy. Your line's been busy. It does not only describe that the line is busy, but Agnes is trying to get information by simply doing or by simply saying that the line has been busy. So she was implicitly asking, who are you talking to? Or She could also say that she's been trying to call her but she couldn't reach her. Or also, something must be up because the line was busy. Or letting Nancy know that Agnes knows that Nancy has been taking a lot of calls. Or maybe all of those at once. Thus, at the end, you could see that Nancy actually answered the question by saying that my father's wife called me without actually Agnes saying that why can't I reach you? Instead, she just used the words your line's been busy. So if it was simply a question, Nancy could have replied, that's right, it was busy, my line's busy, by confirming the description that it was correct, the line's busy. But instead, no. What she did was actually address the question, the action of Nancy, by answering it that, well, I was talking to my father's wife. So the description looks like a description at first, but it's actually an action, trying to get an action from another person by asking and inquiring. Finally, writing the paper. So now that after we have already understood how to analyze the data that we have, now we have to go ahead and write the paper itself. So what does the paper look like? Or what are the important parts of the paper? First off, for obvious reason, is the abstract, which should be written at the last or the latter part of the entire paper or research. Okay, so the first one is introduction. The introduction to a discourse analytic report often consists of a discussion of the limitations of existing psychological research in relation to the subject matter. Researchers will have to review existing discourse analytic studies in their introductions. It is important to be aware of other discourse analytic studies of the same or related phenomena to ensure that one's own study is designed to extend or build upon existing research. Next, the method section. The method section of a discourse analytic report should provide some information about the nature of discourse analysis. The method used to analyze the data needs to be introduced within the context of its theoretical claims about the nature of discourse and its role in the construction of social or psychological realities. This should also include specific type of discourse analysis used, data selection and collection, how the data was transcribed, and how the strategies were identified. Transcription notations are also needed when it is appropriate. Demographic information about participants should only be provided where it is relevant. Like I've said earlier, that discursive psychology's one advantage is that it does not care for the participants who they are, what they are, but rather focuses on what the participant is saying. Remember that discourse analysis is about exploring the ways in which social reality is constructed within a particular context through language. And when you impose that demographic profile of social categories at the outset, it will not be helpful. Alright, so for the next part of the paper, we have to include the presentation of the analysis. This constitutes the most extensive section of the Discourse Analytic Report. The structure of this section should reflect both the research question and the emphasis of the analysis. Extracts are cited verbatim in the report and they must be clearly identified. Next up is the results. After you complete the analysis, it should begin with a brief overview of the findings being discussed. Next up is the discussion. This should include a brief overview of the findings, implications for literature, practical implications, limitations, and suggestions for future research. Next is the references and appendices. All research reports should include a list of reference, including all authors referred to in the report. There may also be appendices containing additional information. These should be clearly labeled and identified at relevant points in the report itself. And finally, a word about process. The attempt to produce a clear and coherent account of one's research in writing allows the researcher to identify inconsistency and tensions, which in turn may lead into new insights.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Aubrey A. Locsin, and now I will be presenting a research sample of a discursive psychology. It is entitled Doing Cognitive Distortions, a Discursive Psychology Analysis of Sex Offender Treatment Talk by Timothy Auburn and Susan Leah. Over the years, theories of sex offending have been linked to cognitive distortions as an important cause of sexual offending. But in this study, they want to critique that notion and suggest that that sort of phenomenon is better understood by adopting a discursive psychology approach wherein talk is regarded as occasion and action-oriented. In here, cognitive distortion is conceptualized as something people do rather than something that they actually have. Participants of this study were from the prison-based sex offender treatment program. They were taped and transcribed, and the analysis was conducted on those sessions relating to the first account of the offenses of the offenders. The analysis of this suggests that the offenders utilize a particular narrative organization to manage the blame and responsibility for the offense that they have committed. It is based on the first part, which is oriented to contingent precursors to the offense, and the second one, which is oriented to a sudden shift in the definition of the situation. The implications of this analysis are also discussed in relation to the status of cognitive distortions and treatment. The objective of this study is to show how offenders' accounts of their offenses can be understood in a discursive psychology perspective. In here, the topic of the analysis is the offender's account. Those accounts are not treated as a route to enduring mental entities like the cognitive distortion. According to this study, there is a growing emphasis on the role of cognitive distortion sa pag-commit ng mga sexual offender ng kanilang wrongdoings. It had been identified na ang maladaptive beliefs and distorted thinking ay central to cognitive distortion. Ngayon, maraming mga treatment interventions with sex offenders ang nag-a-attempt na ma-alter yung cognitive distortions, katulad ng nangyayari sa England and Wales kung saan malaking proportion ng kanilang program ay nakofocus sa pag-challenge ng cognitive distortion sa pamamagitan ng group-based techniques. Malaki rin ang naging influence ng mga feminist readings about sexual offending sa pagkagbibigay attention sa cognitive distortions. In here, the feminist scholars noted that malaki yung discrepancy sa prosecution and conviction of sexual offenses within the criminal justice systems and yung incidence of sexual assaults reported by women of all classes. According sa mga feminist scholars, kaya dumarami ang perpetration of sex crimes ay dahil ang patriarchal society ay in-encourage ito. The central reason why nagkakaroon ng ganitong effect ay dahil sa widespread ideologies and beliefs prevalent as common sense within the patriarchal societies. Sama sa belief na to ang paniniwala na inevitable or uncontrollable ang male sex drive or ang male sexual entitlement. These beliefs are instrumental in promoting sex crimes and silencing women survivors of such crimes. The challenges brought up by the feminist analysis was taken up by different psychologists, and those psychologists sought to identify and measure the attitudes and beliefs that correspond to the elements of patriarchal ideology. There were also attempts to identify the content of the cognitive distortions through research investigations. Because of the growing attention paid to cognitive distortions, it has represented a welcome move toward a more psychological understanding of sexual offending rather than the approaches that emphasize physiological processes. However, in this study, the researchers want to suggest a different way of understanding those distortions and how they relate to sexual offending. The researchers here wanted to place the offenders talk about sex crimes within the domain of social action, drawing upon social resources for its intelligibility, rather than as distorted emanations of a criminal mind. The researchers want to examine how the men describe their offenses and how their versions are designed to produce certain social effects. So rather than an a priori regarding such talk as animated by cognitive distortions, the researchers here examined it for its social action orientation and the way it draws upon socially distributed understandings and forms of talk. The reason why the researchers chose to do a discursive psychology approach in this study because they found two reasons or issues with the cognitive approaches. Because in a cognitive approach, the cognitive distortions are conceptualized as product of cognitive processes. Dahil sa processes na to, nakaka-produce yung mga offenders ng self-statements kung saan na de-deny nila, minimize, justify, and rationalize yung behavior na ginawa nila. The first issue that warrant a turn to a discursive approach is that cognitive approach assume that the description of sexual offenses are animated by distorted cognitive processes. Kaso sa ganitong approach, bibihira na ma-examine systematically yung actual description ng mga offenders sa kanilang offenses and hindi na-identify dito kung kasali ba sa description na to yung belief ng mga offender. Like kung naniniwala ba sila sa male sexual entitlement or naniniwala sila na inevitable or uncontrollable ang male sexual drive. The second issue naman sa cognitive approach is it does not provide any logical constraints on the sorts of self-statements that can be produced by the offenders which would count as distorted. Wala silang restriction para masabi kung ang description ba or account ng isang offender ay distorted. The ability to identify a self-statement as distorted ay nagre-reside sa context ng production nito. The meaning of an utterance and inferences available from it are indexically determined. It varies from context to context. So this indexicality includes how the participants orient to the statements. By using a discursive psychology approach, the accounts of the offenders and their description of offenses can be examined for their action orientation, or how they are constructed and how they achieve particular effects for the social context. Sa paggamit ng ganitong approach, yung mga ordinary activities like pag-describe ng event ay makapagpakita ng sites where psychological business like blaming, seeking help, and shifting responsibility are all constructed. And the first part sa method ng research na to is yung participants. So, sa pagpili nila ng participants, kinuha nila to dun sa sex offender treatment program kung saan merong intensive and long-term group-based treatment. Sa program na to, meron 86 sessions na naglalast between 2 to 2.5 hours and merong 6 to 8 offenders per group and 2 to 3 facilitators. Tapos, sa study na to, yung treatment group na napili ng mga researchers ay based dun sa kung sinong group yung available na, sa time na nag-start silang gumawa ng research project. Tapos, sinundan nila yung mga sex offenders na yun from the initial therapy through the final ones. Ang mga sex offender na to is nagbigay sila ng consent nila para ma-record and para mag-contribute dun sa research. Although, wala silang makukuhang advantage nito when it comes to their sentence or yung parole nila. And out of the 8 participants dun sa group nun is 3 offenders lang yung napili para mag-contribute dun sa analysis na gagamitin. Tapos, etong mga offenders na to is napili sila dahil sa practical analytic criteria and dun sa conviction nila dahil yung tatlong yun is may different types of offense sila. So, the first offender, he sexually abused his daughter for many years and yung second offender naman is sexual assault sa young woman and may kasama siya dun habang ginawa niya yung sexual assault na yun. And the third one is yung sexual assault of a young girl na kinidnap niya. And now, we're gonna talk about the analytic procedure. And sa part na to is, yung unang stage niya is yung pag-brief sa mga offenders about the nature of cognitive distortion. And after that, each offender has to take the hot seat wherein na-narrate nila and nag-give account sila about sa kung ano yung main offense nila. And yung mga main offense nila, ito yung kadalasan dahilan kung bakit sila nakakulong. And after that, magbibigay sila ng detailed life story nila. And during the conversation is, during the delivery of their account is yung other group members, they will challenge the offender's narrative. They will challenge yung mga discrepancy, inconsistency, and mga unbelievable aspects na sinasabi ng offender. And malaking tulong to kasi it helps provoke debate and vigorous argumentation rather than yung simpleng conversation or simpleng question and answer exchange lang. And sa etong pag-challenge na to is nakakatulong sa defender na maggawa sila ng active account or makabuo sila ng active account na hindi nagre-rely sa denial, minimization ng responsibility nila or ng victim distress, or kasi nag-emphasize to dun sa offender's own agency. Ang aim nito is to challenge the cognitive distortions and para yung mga offenders magkaroon sila ng insight sa kung ano yung own pattern of thinking nila, and makakatulong to sa later parts ng program na kung saan yung huling part ng program nila is nakafocus dun sa relapse prevention strategies. And yung sessions kung saan yung mga selected offenders ay nasa hot seat, ito yung kinopya sa audio tape, and yung analysis na dito is nakafocus dun sa pagbibigay ng offender ng description nila sa kanilang main offense. So, in this part of the procedure, the researchers were able to generate 8 hours of relevant audio tape interaction and approximately 50 pages of transcribed text. And they analyzed it using the principles of discursive psychology. And sa pag-analyze nila ng text is they gave particular attention dun sa ways in which events, categories, or objects were discursively constructed. And sa pag-analyze nila sa kung paano ginawa yung version of events, kung paano na-construct yun, and kung anong functionality nila, the analyst takes into account the matters such as the linguistic and rhetorical devices na ginamit, and yung use of particular terminology, how other participants orient to and respond sa sinabi, and kung ano pa yung mga potential alternative constructions available. Now, we're gonna talk about the analysis of this research. So, sa analysis na to, nakafocus siya dun sa offender's turn on the hot seat, and the point kung saan nagbibigay sila ng description nila sa kanilang main offense. In the analysis of the text corpus, it suggests that the offender's description were designed around the following broad narrative structure. So the first one is scene setting. It is designed to counteract potential versions of the offense, and the next one is to establish quotidian concerns are precursors to the offense. And yung part 2 naman ng structure is yung shift in the definition of the situation, which is designed to show how the offense can plausibly follow from the quotidian concerns and mitigate their responsibility for the offense. So, in this analysis, the first one is the scene setting, which is used to counteract other potential versions of the offense, and this can be seen in this extract, the first extract. The PO1 here is the probationary officer, while the OFF is the offender. Yung mga pangalan nila is binago. So, mapapansin sa pagsagot ni offender sa tanong ni probationary officer na siya ay unhesitant. From this, it can be read as something na cooperative move in the treatment process. But in a discursive analysis, this reply suggests that it is oriented to a range of matters relevant to the stake of the speaker. Mapapansin na hindi niya lang to sinagot na yes, dinagdag niya yung that was the start of it. Meron siyang nilagay na additional information. It is used to counter other version of events na pwedeng mag-position sa kanya as more predatory offender. In this part of the analysis, ang pinapakita naman as yung quotidian precursors where the offenders are giving descriptions of the ordinary activities na ginagawa nila before they committed the crime. Makikita rin dito yung sequence of events that led up to the offense without prior planning. In this extract, the offender is convicted of attempted rape with an accomplice. Ipinapakita rin sa extract na to yung ordinary activities na ginagawa nila, which is yung pag-park and pag-urinate. Although hindi nasabi dito sa extract na to, nabanggit ng mga offender na kaya sila nasa place na yun is because naghahanap sila ng matutulugan kasi galing sila ng disco. In line 6 and 7, sinasabi dito, and you know it's nice and quiet, really quite secluded there. Ito ine-evaluate ng offender yung location as quiet and secluded, which is consistent dun sa motive nila na makahanap ng tahimik na lugar para matulog. This motive can be heard as a defensible inference, wherein the narrator claims that his reason for selecting that place is para nga makatulog. And an alternative inference for this is that suitable place yon for carrying out a rape as a coincidence of these intentional activities and not as the reason for selecting that parking place. Sa line 8 naman is makikita or indicated yung pagdating ng girl, which is their victim. So, dumating yung victim nila after all the activities they have done, which is yung pag-park and yung pag-evaluate ng location. So, sa sequencing na ito, ini-indicate na yung victim, dumating siya independent of the interests or concerns of the offender. Makikita rin natin sa line 8 na yung form of description na ginamit ng offender, it reinforces the coincidence ng event. First, he selects a descriptor, the term this girl, para ipakita na general category of girls and hindi siya yung specific target. Second naman, the actions of the girl are constructed by the offender as circumstantial and in contrast with the intention of the offender. These features allow the inference that this part of the incident, yung pagdating ng girl, it simply unfolded independent of anyone's planning or motivation. In this part of the analysis, the researcher concluded that the description of the offender shows the systematic way in which they are rhetorically constructed to perform several relevant social actions such as orienting to provide hearers with a plausible version of events, which shows that they are cooperative with the aims of the treatment program. Another one is they are oriented to counteract or preempt other potential version of those events. Based sa analysis ng researchers, the construction of mundaneness is one of the main features of the descriptions done by the offenders. The offender, as one of the main characters in this narrative, is simply going about being accountably normal. The offenders also provided conditions for plausible deniability. They have the ability to deny motives that may be attributed to them, wherein they would be positioned as someone acting in a much more considered criminal way. In here, yung plausible deniability, na-achieve siya ng mga offenders sa pag-i-insert ng particular details or evaluation which account for their sometimes anomalous actions within the context of their being ordinary. In the second part of the analysis, it shows the shift in the situation that is designed to show how the offense can plausibly follow from the quotidian concerns and mitigate responsibility for the subsequent offense. And makikita dito sa extract na to kung paano nag-arise yung sexual offense out of normal or ordinary activities they were doing. Itong extract na to ay continuation ng naunang scene. Nag-develop yung narrator ng description of the sequence of events na makita from line 9 to 17. Importante itong sequencing na to kasi dito pinapakita kung paano na-provoke ng isang event yung mga sumusunod na pangyayari. The narrator here described that the girl was walking past them, and as the girl was walking past them, nag-whistle yung kasama niya. Itong part na nag-whistle yung accomplice niya dun sa babae is yung mark sa changing definition of the situation. After that, nag-provide yung narrator sa mga hearers niya ng actions ng babae. These make available set of inference about the woman's interpretation of the scene na involved siya. By observing that the woman heard the whistle and sort of stepped up a bit, the narrator was suggesting that the victim believed this to be at least uncomfortable. The narrator here attributed the responsibility for that action to the accomplice. And ito yung minark niya as shifting the definition of the situation. Pinapakita rin ng narrator dito na yung shift ng pangyayari ay independent sa kanyang intention, planning, or forethought. Kasi ang plano lang naman talaga niya kung bakit siya nasa place na yun is para matulog. Hindi part rito ang mag-commit ng rape. The second part of this analysis shows that the offenders are oriented to providing hearers with plausible account of the offense, and that arose from seemingly accountably ordinary activities. And dito rin, the offenders construct a radical shift sa nature ng situation, which is constructed by the narrator to sound like unanticipated, and thereby it set in a train sequence of events leading to the eventual offense. Next naman na pansin nila is that the narrators position themselves in different agentic positions. Most likely, yung mga narrator is passive sila in the events rather than active instigator. And pinapakita rin dito na engage sila sa ibang activity that lacks criminal association in contrast of planning the offense. Development ng situation, the offenders attribute it to another narrative character, kung saan yung narrative character na yun is siya yung actively instigating the shift in the definition of the situation. Itong shift na to sa situation ang nag-provoke sa offender na gawin yung offense. It is an impulsive response from the narrative character. All in all, these descriptions were supposedly done para ma-mitigate yung responsibility ng offender sa involvement niya dun sa kinumit niyang sexual offense. One of the aim of this paper is to present a way of examining talk in a offender treatment group. And this is different from the traditional way of treating talk. And based sa analysis ng mga researcher, nalaman nila na even though small parts or extracts lang yung pinili nila, those extracts were consequential in terms of constructing an identity for the offender. And by analyzing the extracts as a social interaction, nalaman na ginagamit ng mga offender ito to mitigate their culpability. It's also noticeable na onti lang sa mga sinabi ng offenders yung self-statement. And by treating talk as action-oriented, mapapakita na kung paano yung talk is designed to construct a moral position for the speaker. The researchers in this study paid attention to how those speakers construct their talk as a way to manage the blame and responsibility for the offenses na nakonvict sila. However, hindi kiniklaim ng researcher na successful yung mga offender sa pagkamit ng objective nila. Pero, ang kiniklaim lamang nila is that yung understanding of the treatment group is na-enhanced by attempting to understand what is the participant doing in that context. The notion ng cognitive distortion, may implication na ang sexual offender ay incompetent or may deficit. But in this close analysis sa narrative ng mga offender in this study, napag-alaman nila na gumagamit yung offender ng descriptive rhetoric to construct moral positions and they are skilled in using it. Now I am going to present my answer to epistemological questions. Here is the first question. What kind of knowledge does discursive psychology aim to produce? Discursive psychology is concerned with how people use discursive resources to achieve interpersonal objectives in social interaction. It focuses on the action orientation, or how the participants use their discursive resources and the consequences or effects of it for the participants. Discursive psychology uses a relativist social constructionist approach wherein language is used as a form of social action that constructs version of reality for a certain objective. The knowledge it aims to produce brought into being by using interpretative repertoire and discursive devices. In this study, the sexual offenders use their discursive resources to provide hearers with a plausible version of events, counteract other versions of their offense, and mitigate their culpability. It shows that sexual offenders are skilled in the use of descriptive rhetoric, which is contrasting to the notion of cognitive distortion. The second question is, what kind of assumption does discursive psychology make about the world? The assumption that discursive psychology makes about the world is that it sees the world as a shifting and negotiable place that can only be understood through language. It recognizes that it is possible to have several versions of events without making a judgment of the truth. This approach shows that any event can be represented in different versions that produce different positions, which in turn make different ways of evaluating. For talk is assumed to be action-oriented, different versions of the same event can arise depending on the different interactional contexts that they are constructed to serve. In this study, the researchers examined talk for its social action and orientation and the way it drawn upon socially distributed understandings rather than making a priori assumptions. The third question is, how does discursive psychology conceptualize the role of the researcher in the research process? The role of the researcher in the research process in discursive psychology is the author. The researcher has an active role in constructing the research findings. The researchers in this study were the ones who gave insight on the extract they have chosen from the recorded conversation with the sexual offenders. They were the ones who analyzed how the versions of events were discursively constructed by focusing on the particular terminology, linguistic, and rhetorical devices used. They also made inferences on what the offender's narrative of offense implied about the offender's identity.
Alright, so let's now proceed to the study that I have chosen to present. It is entitled Contesting the National Interest and Maintaining Our Lifestyle, a Discursive Analysis of Political Rhetoric Around Climate Change. This study was conducted by Tim Kurtz, Martha Augoustinos, Shona Crabb. Alright, so let me give you an introduction of the entire study. So this study was conducted last 2007 and it is situated in the Australian context. So the release of the fourth United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, report in February 2007, which stated the need for countries to reduce global emissions of carbon dioxide. So this entire analysis was based on two candidates from major Australian political parties, namely the current administration during the time in 2007, which was the Liberal National Party coalition government, and the opposition, which was the Australian Labor Party, or ALP, or the ALP. So under the Liberal Party, you have to realize, under the Liberal Party, Australia, alongside United States, is one of the two developed countries who have not yet ratified the Kyoto Protocol. So what is the Kyoto Protocol? Kyoto Protocol is like a commitment of industrialized countries and economies in transition to limit and reduce greenhouse gases emissions in accordance to agreed individual targets. So the release of this IPCC report coincided with the first sitting week of that year's Australian election. So the ALP used that as a key platform in their campaign, Action on Climate Change, quote unquote. So the November 24th election of that year, it was actually won by the Labour Party. According to exit polls that was conducted, 70% indicated that climate change was one of the areas that distinguished the two parties from one another. This data at first glance would suggest a relatively straightforward reading of climate change in action in the public consciousness of Australia. However, there is a potential theoretical limitation of that kind of data. Exit polls may have suggested that respondents voted for Labour due to the cognitive representation of Labour being more willing to take action on climate change, but it is also important to interrogate discursively the ways in which Labour Party, as well as the Liberal Party, actually constructed the attitude on climate change in question in their political rhetoric. So let me give you a brief overview of just some existing data that was used in the study to support the current study. So according to Dickerson 1998, discursive analysis of national interest talk in televised political discourse, for example, found that national interest was a rhetorical resource that was drawn upon by politicians to accomplish two main functions. The first one, to construct social realities that forward particular ideological agendas. Two, to attend on local interactional concerns such as exoneration and blaming. So the national interest here becomes a useful resource when discussing the intentions behind someone's or other people's political actions, and at the same time for constructing and prescribing political reality. In lifestyle maintenance, one study that supported the current study was when Luke outlines the ways in which environmentalism as an issue become increasingly framed as a threat to the American life. So we can see that particular constructions of lifestyle maintenance are often put together in a politicized context in a way that relies heavily on the notion of national interest. Now, let's talk about the purpose of the study. So, there are two famous rhetorical arguments in political debates, namely acting in national interest, quote unquote, and lifestyle maintenance, quote unquote. So, this is going to be analyzed in the paper. The current study was concerned with identifying the particular discursive practices and rhetorical strategies used by both major parties in formal and informal political talk about the problem of and solutions to climate change. So now let's go and talk about the aims. So in the Australian context, a large portion of their GDP is actually generated from coal and aluminum iron ore. So the aims of the study is of social psychological interest to investigate the ways in which the issue of national interest was mobilized and managed by political parties from both sides of the political spectrum, and also to investigate how national interest was used from both sides to the climate change debate, and also to investigate the ways in which the politicians navigated the controversial topic in which proposed the changes in the lifestyle of the citizens. Now let's talk about the data. So the data that they used in the study was naturally occurring qualitative data that was collected from various broadcast and online media. And the corpus of the data consists of public speeches, television and radio media interviews, official political party media releases, as well as Hansard transcripts of debates in both houses of the Australian Parliament. So the entire data were collected from February 1 until the end of July 2007. However, the data used focused specifically on February 2 to April 30. The current analysis was based specifically upon 139 public statements, 98 are from ALP and 41 from the Coalition, as well as 172 pages of parliamentary transcripts of debates in Parliament that directly address the topic of climate change. The analysis method made use of principles of discursive psychology and rhetorical psychology. Both of these approaches have as their focus the ways in which discourse and rhetoric actively construct particular versions of social reality, which in turn accomplish particular social and interactional objectives such as explaining, justifying, blaming, and accusing. The analysis focused on examining the constructions made available by these ways of talking and the implications of such constructions. Let's go to the analysis and discussion. So here in extract 1, we could see that this is said by Turnbull, who is under the Liberal Party. He said those lines that functioned in the parliamentary debate to present the Labour policy of action on climate change as flawed, when he said the lines from when there are thousands of Australians out of work, when instead of adding 2 million jobs as the Howard government has done, 2 million jobs were swept. Still, under the first extract, Turnbull also repeatedly emphasized on the words you and your. This is to function as in constructing that the ALP as in the opposition to the people and by implication to the national interest. Look at the lines when he said, because you have done the right thing. We have sacrificed you in the interest of our ideology. You have been sacrificed, your jobs, your livelihoods. Here in extract number 2, we have Kevin Rudd, the running Prime Minister of ALP, who charged the current administration as full of climate change skeptics, trying to downplay the other party, in which Howard, or John Howard, the running Prime Minister of the other party, redirected the flow of the discourse by showing how the policies of the opposition as flawed and against the national interest, that his policy of nuclear power was the best choice. Rather than denying what the opposition called him as a climate change skeptic, he embraced it and used it in his discourse to construct how that skepticism is a good thing. You can see here Kevin Rudd actually not just describe the other party as a climate change skeptic, but rather he was actually asking why he is or why they are a climate change skeptic, in which the other party replied to, yes, I am a skeptic. So he explained further instead of, like, if it's just a description, okay, I am a skeptic. But here he explained further, in which he also justified why he is a skeptic. So we can see that there is an action orientation happening in this discourse. So Peter Gray, under the ALP as well, used an extreme case formulation by stating the lines from number 6. Australian businesses have been sacrificed on the altar when the government failed to ratify the Kyoto policy. Lastly, Kevin Rudd's statements functioned to invoke the notion of personal responsibility in addressing the climate change issue. He used this discourse to function in a way to persuade people that they can also help in addressing the problem of climate change. Here in this extract, we could see that Kevin Rudd used the personal responsibility not just to describe that climate change is a personal responsibility too, but it's also an action, trying to get an action from the audience, saying that or convincing them that they can also do something about climate change. Under the same extract, we could see Kevin Rudd's introduction of smart meters, which emphasizes on the need for significant reductions in energy consumption that can only be effected by compromises to existing modern lifestyles. So we can see that ALP in particular was able to construct a drastic and immediate action on climate change as being reconcilable with maintenance of the consumer lifestyle, as opposed to requiring drastic or immediate changes in citizens' day-to-day practices or institutional arrangements that governs them. So the complex issue, which is talking about climate change in debates, is an advantage for social and psychological inquiry or investigation. Such inquiry should, to our mind, work at the multiple levels and should certainly involve individual and community level behavior change investigation. So in the contemporary Australian political context, these discursive limits appear to revolve around the need to construct accounts of climate change policy in terms of national interest and lifestyle maintenance, so that they could invoke an economic notion in order to provide warrant for their policies on climate change, so that they could garner support from people. So the advantage of the approach to analysis adopted here is that it allows one to examine the implications of the specific ways in which such culturally pervasive or widespread rhetorical resources are deployed by political leaders in such contexts as debates and media interrogation. So, moreover, and perhaps most importantly, the approach used also allowed for an examination of both the ways in which climate change policy is formulated to attend to a wider culturally pervasive understandings and specific methods by which it is marketed and to an electorate and defended against political opponents' critique. Now, let's go ahead and talk about 3 epistemological questions. Question number 1. What kind of knowledge does discursive psychology aim to produce? One of the main purposes of discursive psychology is how do people achieve, or at least attempt to achieve, some kind of action orientation that accomplishes something in the interaction. In relation to that, The kind of knowledge that discursive psychology aims to produce in this study is an understanding of the process by which the two politicians use the two popular rhetorical argument, informal and informal political talks, into their favor to construct their solutions for climate change and convince people to vote for them.
This study adopts a social constructionism epistemology.
Question number 2. What kinds of assumptions does discursive psychology make about the world? This study shows how over the course of the election period, both the candidates oriented themselves on different discourses that benefited them on their campaign. They oriented towards rhetorical arguments that serves their performance of social actions. As a result, the politicians negotiated their positions through their discourses. Thus, discursive psychology used the relativist position in this study. And lastly, how does discursive psychology conceptualize the role of the researcher in the research process? The researcher plays an active role in the research because it is through them that the discourse analysis of the research is analyzed thoroughly. As stated, the researcher could be compared to the writer or author of the research itself. They take the discourse and debates said by the candidates and the other politicians and draw up a picture of what their discourse is trying to accomplish, which is to persuade people that their proposals or policies will help in reducing carbon dioxide emissions while still protecting national interests and maintaining lifestyle. The researchers made the readers understand how the discourse of the two candidates ultimately constructed who was going to win the elections.